Welcome to Watercooler. I'm Nick Cater, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. Today I want to take you through a critical piece of research that points the way to the future as we begin to climb out of this COVID-19 recession. Powering out a pandemic, unleashing the potential of natural gas, is a report published by the Menzies Research Centre, and it's written by one of Australia's most respected energy economists, Dr. Brian Fisher. The message, in a nutshell, is that our future depends on gas. We need gas, and we need lots more of it if we're going to make manufacturing competitive and bring down the price of electricity. This report is about how we make the most of our competitive advantages to grow the economy and generate jobs, while at the same time leading the world in reducing greenhouse emissions. That's right, leading the world. As the song says, we have every reason to rejoice in this country. It abounds in nature's gifts. Australia has abundant reserves of almost every conceivable energy source. It's home to 14% of the world's proven coal reserves, 30% of known uranium reserves, and 18% of the world's lithium. We've invested more per person in wind and solar than any other country. And then there's natural gas. Australia is the world's #1 supplier of liquid natural gas. It provides a quarter of our own domestic energy needs, and it's essential to powering industry. Natural gas has been around for quite a while. Offshore drilling in the Bass Strait has been going on for more than 50 years, supplying around 8 trillion cubic feet of gas to Victoria and on to New South Wales via a pipeline. But two things have changed that will make natural gas the prime energy source of our future. The first is technology. Hydraulic fracking has made it possible, profitable, and most importantly safe to extract gas from the tight rock formations, opening up trillions more cubic feet of natural gas deep underground. Liquid natural gas supertankers have tripled in size in the last 20 years, making transport much cheaper. These supertankers can carry up to 250,000 cubic metres of natural gas. That's enough to power Australia's natural gas market for 60 days. A second change is the cycle in demand for Australian energy because of the impact that introducing renewable energy generation has had. 10 years ago, we were relying on baseload coal supplemented with some gas and a little renewable energy to power Australia night and day. But generous incentives for renewable energy introduced by the Labor government, combined by extra incentives from state governments, have sent investment in wind and solar soaring. In 2020, on almost any given day, wind and solar can provide enough energy to power much of Australia's east coast during working hours. South Australia often generates so much renewable energy that it has to give it away. But as the sun begins to sink and people return home and start powering up the air conditioner, the energy companies suddenly need extra sources of supply. And they need it really quickly before the grid starts shutting down. With more and more renewables coming into the system, the duck curve, as it's known, is becoming even more pronounced. And with 2/3 of our coal-fired power stations scheduled to retire in the next 20 years, we need a solution. We could, of course, replace coal generators with new coal generators. Coal is, after all, reliable and it's relatively cheap. But the capital costs are quite high, and although the technology is getting better, coal doesn't lend itself to ramping up and down as quickly as we need it to do with the pattern of consumption we now have. We could try batteries, of course, but the cold hard fact is that the technology isn't there yet. They're expensive, they don't have the capacity required to power a grid for more than a very brief time. Then there's hydro, which combined with renewables can pump water back up the hill and let it flow down again. But Australia's hydro capacity is necessarily limited by our topography, and installation is expensive. Planning and construction times are uncertain and slow. There are other solutions. There's nuclear, which is technically a brilliant solution, but nuclear remains extremely expensive to install And rightly or wrongly, it's got regulatory problems, which means that it'll take a very long time. The next generation of modular reactors are looking promising, but they're far from fully developed. Then there's hydrogen, which has great potential, as my school reports used to say, but the technology is still in the experimental stage. It's definitely worth investing in R&D, but hydrogen, is it the way of the future? Come back and ask me that question in 10 years' time. Which leaves us with gas. Gas is cheap to install, it's quick to install, it can be quickly ramped up, and there's lots of it, much of it close to where it's needed most in New South Wales and Victoria. But wait, there's more. Natural gas has got clear advantages over coal. Gas is 50% more energy dense than coal. It emits half as much carbon dioxide. It emits 40 times less sulfur dioxide and less nitrous oxide, and almost no mercury. It requires 25 to 50 times less water to generate electricity. The extraction of gas makes less impact on the landscape than either wind or solar, and it's transported invisibly and cleanly through low maintenance pipes without disturbing the community, all of which we argue makes natural gas the most suitable partner for renewable energy and the linchpin of our energy future. You can download a copy of our report from our website www.mensesrc.org. Joining me now from our office in Canberra is the author of the report, Dr. Brian Fisher. Brian, let's deal with the cost first. Why is it that we are the largest exporter of natural gas in the world? The cost here in Australia is still relatively expensive.
Well, basically that's because we've seen a situation where we have really had a shortage of gas on the East Coast. Our traditional export has come out of Western Australia, and there's always been lots of domestic gas in Western Australia, but on the East Coast we've had restrictions on exploration, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, until very recently, and as a consequence of that, we've had a shortage of gas, which has been exacerbated by exports of some gas out of the coal seam gas resources in Queensland as LNG. Now that's a new industry, and that has also had some impact on supply on the East Coast.
We can go in a minute to how we might get some of that gas from Western Australia and indeed from Queensland, perhaps the Northern Territory, down to the populous hearts of Victoria and New South Wales. But first of all, that gas which has essentially been locked away because of government moratoria of various one sorts or another, how easy is it to get at that gas in Victoria and New South Wales, and how much is there, and to what extent, I guess, can that help satisfy the demand in those two states?
Well, I mean, we never really know until the exploration is completed exactly how much supply there is, but I think the evidence is that there's really no shortage of gas in terms of what's under the ground. The real issue is ensuring that we have a set of government incentives and arrangements, regulatory arrangements in place that don't discourage that exploration and development of that gas. And until recently, it's certainly been the case that there's been very, very little activity on the exploration front in either New South Wales or Victoria.
And based on the wisdom that the cheapest gas is always the closest gas, that's where surely we should be looking first to make up for the shortage of supply in the southeast of Australia.
Well, absolutely, because if you were to attempt to build a transcontinental pipeline to bring gas from Western Australia, I think it's almost certain that's going to be uneconomic. I mean, it's a very, very long way. You have to compress that gas all the way to get it to travel through a pipeline, and you'd be using more gas than you basically got out the end of the pipe. to compress it to transport it. So transporting gas by pipeline, by overland pipeline from Western Australia seems like an uneconomic prospect. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that you can't transport Western Australian gas as LNG in tankers. That is an alternative.
Yeah, and that's much cheaper now than it was, say, 15 years ago. Now that we have larger ships and more efficient ways of compressing and loading that gas, isn't it? So it's quite conceivable, I would think, that we will be able to get gas from Western Australia, indeed other parts of the world, into import terminals in, say, Sydney or Melbourne, at a cost which is competitive. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the propositions for import of gas into, say, Crib Point or Port Kembla are looking like as if they're going to be economic, and I'd expect to see one or two or perhaps three of those import terminals established in the coming 5 years.
Because I think, as we note in the report, and this became apparent, I think, as I started to study this subject, that we're now moving into a new phase in international gas markets, essentially becoming a world commodity price. So rather than a supplier doing a discrete contract with a buyer and shipping their gas, it's much more like oil or indeed wheat, where the gas just feeds in and it's got a futures market, and that market responds in quite an agile manner. There's arbitrage, all those things push down the international price. There must surely be great benefits for our domestic gas now that we're hooked into that, or getting more and more attached to that international commodity market.
Yeah, well, I think what's happening is basically that we're seeing the international gas market move more towards a spot market, similar to the markets that we see in other commodities. Now, traditionally, as far as LNG is concerned, we've seen that market dominated by long-term contracts, simply because it was necessary to sign those contracts to fund the development of the projects. Now, funding and financial arrangements still exist, of course, but we have seen more activity on the spot market as time goes on, and I'd expect to see a continuing transformation of that market, much like we've seen the markets, for example, in iron ore, move away from long-term contracts more towards index-type markets and spot markets.
Yeah, so to sum up then, we made some assumptions there. You have to make some assumptions about broadly what you expect the price of gas to do to judge whether this is going to be economical in the long term. I think, although I think you and I would both be cautious about being too detailed about this, after all, we don't make our money on the futures markets, but there is room for optimism that the domestic gas, in line with world gas prices, will be at a level where it becomes affordable to use gas as one of our mainstay fuels for the next couple of decades. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've just gone through a period where we had gas, it's some days getting to $15 a gigajoule on the East Coast, $12, and now we've settled back to much more moderate levels, which are more sensible. $6 or $7 sounds like a reasonable sort of price for gas. And at that price, if that's established over the longer term, then you can see gas as a competitive fuel.
And we take the view, I think, don't we, Brian, both of us, that competition is very important. So if you've got gas, for instance, being imported, competing with gas being drilled locally in Victoria and New South Wales, competing possibly with gas coming from the north, from Queensland, from Beetaloo, that to us, let's not go to the economics of whether a business is going to invest with that much competition, but we like that competition. That's going to be good for consumers. It has to be.
Well, yeah, more competition and more transparency, and no matter what the market is in the end good for both consumers and producers.
So what number one key recommendation in our report is more transparency, more detail about what the market's doing so that people can judge accordingly. More competition, number one priority. Let's go to the technical aspects of gas now, Brian. I suspected we were having this conversation 10 years ago, looking to Australia's future energy requirements. We probably at that stage would have put a lot more emphasis on coal, simply because there was much greater need for a base load supply then at that point. Could you explain why that's changed and what the difference is between a base load supply of energy and the sort of things that we're looking to gas to do these days?
Well, but basically, if we're talking about, if we just think about the electricity industry for a moment, if we're talking about coal-fired power plants, they need to run virtually all of the time. They're slow to start. They don't like being cooled down, and they're not all that responsive in terms of dealing with changes in the load in the electricity system. Now, what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is a massive increase in the share of renewables, solar and wind, basically, in the electricity system, to the point now in South Australia where we've got around about half of the supply going into South Australia from renewable energy. Now, the challenge with that is that the sun doesn't shine all the time, of course, and the wind is also unpredictable, so we get lots of variability in when that power is coming into the system. Now, to balance that, you need to be able to inject something else very rapidly into the electricity system to ensure that the power grid remains stable. And one of the advantages of gas is that gas-fired power plants are fast start, very responsive, so they can respond to situations where you have drops in solar output, for example, or unpredicted drops in output from wind power plants. And as a consequence of that, gas has become more important in the system. Now, of course, gas is not the only possibility for backing up renewables. It can be backed up by hydro. We have the Snowy scheme, for example, and there are also lots of proposals for pumped hydro, special pumped hydro systems dotted around the place that would potentially help in backing up the system. And of course, in the future, we'll also end up with lots of batteries. The big challenge with batteries at the moment is, first of all, they're quite expensive, and second, that the amount of batteries that you would need to back up the NEM is very, very large indeed. So from a practical point of view, you need something other than batteries to back the system up.
Yeah, and I don't think it's broadly realised quite how far batteries are away from doing this job, right? The job of backing up the energy supply and providing energy for a reasonable period of time. So in South Australia last year, 0.3% of energy came from batteries, which is very small considering the quite substantial investment they've made there. I think, Brian, I'm right in saying a battery does have some useful function in just stabilising the grid at that critical moment where the power falls, right? It's that sort of instantaneous stabilisation, but if you're looking for something that's going to back you up for the rest of the afternoon, forget it. That would be right.
Well, I think the batteries are very, very useful in terms of short-term backup and maintaining frequency, for example, in the system. But if we're thinking about a wind drought for a couple of days, which is possible when you look at Australia's weather systems, you can have a high pressure system parked over southeastern Australia for a couple of days, which means that we have limited amounts of wind during that period. So you basically need something else in the system to ensure that we've got power available. And big users like, for example, like aluminium smelters, have to run continuously. You can't have a situation develop where unexpectedly you have no power to an aluminium smelter, because that results in the aluminium solidifying in the pots and effectively doing massive damage to the facility. So for facilities like that, reliable power that's delivered 24 hours a day is very, very important. So, for the foreseeable future, we will need to see some means of backing up our system that is completely reliable, and gas has an important part to play in that role.
On that point about smelters, we started writing this report, or you started writing it, before the COVID-19 lockdowns really set in. But now, of course, we realise that we have to focus on security of manufacturing, making manufacturing in this country competitive again. How important is gas in that equation?
Well, gas is actually very important, because gas is one of the most important sources of heat for manufacturing. And if you think about it, most things we do require heat of one form or another. So you can't process food without heat. Basically, you can't smelt metals without heat. You can't do most. In fact, you can't do most manufacturing without some sort of heat. So at least for the foreseeable future, I think there's a role of gas. And I suspect after our experience with COVID-19, governments are going to be more inclined to be concerned about the security of manufacturing systems domestically, supply chains, for example. And that also means that you have to ensure that our energy supply chains are secure in Australia. So I suspect there's going to be more policy focus on domestic supply chains and security of those supply chains in the future, not only here in Australia, but all over the world.
Now, intermittent renewable energy, wind, solar, I think we don't really go in the report, no need to, about whether it was wise to inject so much renewables in the system so quickly. It is what it is. But it seems to me that the idea that gas is somehow a competitor with renewables is to completely misconstrue the situation. I mean, in actual fact, without gas or a similarly effective way of backing up renewables, you just can't get more renewables in the system, can you? So if you want to increase the penetration of renewables in the system and increase its capacity, as has happened in South Australia from I think about 35% to close to 50% in the space of 3 years, you've got to have gas. That's the great enabler. The two go hand in hand, don't they?
Well, I think basically all state governments have got some very ambitious views about the extent to which renewables will contribute to the electricity system over the next 10 to 15, 20 years. And you have to be able to we use the word firm those renewables. In other words, you have to ensure that you have some means of backing the system up and dealing with the variability that's inherent in those systems. Now, the technologies that we have available at the moment are gas, batteries, and hydro. We have, and we know something about the costs of all of those things. At the moment, in terms of capital cost, gas is by far the cheapest way of backing those systems up, because basically we have an established grid. We have gas-fired power plants at various points in that grid. We've built both the pipeline system and the electricity system around fossil fuels in the past. And it turns out that at least until 2035, I think, it's reasonably safe to say that the capital cost of backing the system up is going to be cheapest if we use gas. And there's no doubt that we have to back the system up. And the only alternative, of course, is to live with a much more unreliable electricity system. And we know that consumers are not very fond of blackouts. And certainly we can't really have a situation develop where we've got long blackouts disrupting the operations of things like our smelter industry.
There's a cost, of course, to ramping up the supply of gas. We're going to need more infrastructure. We're going to need more pipeline capacity. We may need, for instance, to reverse the pipeline, which currently runs one way from Victoria to New South Wales, to send it both ways. We'll need probably thicker pipes. We'll need pipes to new places. It's money, isn't it, Brian? So what role is there for government in making these sort of infrastructure decisions and making them happen?
Well, I think the key thing there is to ensure that our regulatory and policy frameworks are such that you don't disincentivise the development of these competing technologies. Now, I think governments of all persuasions have a tendency to say that they're agnostic to various technologies, and that's a good thing. But I think the trick is to ensure that there are not hidden disincentives to development of these technologies. And we've also got to keep in mind what's going to come in the future. For example, there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen as the fuel of the future. But of course, we have to be able to transport hydrogen in some way. And there is some prospect of also mixing hydrogen with natural gas to reduce the extent of to which you've got greenhouse gas emissions coming from, or the share of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the system. So it's not impossible to imagine a situation where you can reuse some of these pipelines in the future. So not only do we need to think about policy settings today, we also need to think about what other technologies we're going to be dealing with in the future, and how are our infrastructure systems going to be adapted to deal with that.
Yeah, and while we might sort of blink a bit at the cost of installing gas transmission, I think the point that comes through in your report is there's always a cost. So if Victoria, say for example, stuck by its gas moratorium, didn't encourage or allow new gas plants to be built, it would have to increase the capacity of its interconnector to suck in more power from New South Wales, probably also from Tasmania. And that costs a lot of money too, right? So there's an expenditure here. I guess the question for the government is, where's the best place for it to make that expenditure, whether it's gas pipelines, electricity transmission, or a combination of both?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's been a tendency, I think, to talk a lot about the renewable electricity system without being prepared to discuss the fact that you can't build a solar power plant at Broken Hill without connecting it to the system. Well, there's not much point because there's not much demand, for example, in Broken Hill. Lots of sun, but not much demand. So you need to connect that to the central grid. Now, that means you have to build transmission lines, and typically those things cost a lot of money. Pipelines cost a lot of money, transmission lines cost a lot of money, and basically what we need to do is think about the system as an integrated whole and minimise the costs associated with the full system.
So a state like South Australia, for instance, is getting close to energy self-sufficient now. I see when you look at the charts, it does bring in some power from interstate at peak times, but it wouldn't take a lot, to me, it seems, a lot more investment in gas, perhaps investing in some new infrastructure to get more gas down from the Cooper Basin, and you would really do away with the need for those interstate connectors, right? Or at least you won't need to enlarge them, I think is the point.
Well, I mean, I don't know that you can actually keep the NEM working effectively without additional transmission in the system, is my guess. Particularly given that state governments are increasing the share of solar and wind in each of their systems. So I think inevitably, as that happens, we will need to increase the investment in transmission.
So there's no getting out of that one. So, but onto the very important point about emissions, Brian. We are on a course. We are tracking to reduce our emissions in line with our Paris commitments by 2030. As you know, there's a lot of political arguments and pressure at the moment to go even further, to talk about a zero 2050 target. The Menzies Research Centre, I think, opposes that idea, not because we don't want to get to zero, we don't think that's a good idea, but because by setting a target, you're making the assumptions that you're not really in a place to do about technology. But putting that aside, what will be the effects of really increasing the amount of gas, possibly putting gas into place as coal generators come to the end of their lives? How significant an effect will that have on our greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think you can see the importance of the effect of gas just by looking at what's happened in either Europe or the United States. There's been massive reductions over the last 10 years in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States as a consequence of the conversion of their power systems from coal to gas. Now, that's happened not because of any necessary policy changes, but because the price of gas has been much, much cheaper than it was, say, 20 years ago, compared with coal. So, and a similar thing happened in Europe. Basically, in the 80s and 90s, had a massive transformation of the power system away from coal in Europe, and a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's simply occurring because for every megawatt of power you generate with coal, if that's replaced by generation with gas, then you're producing about half the greenhouse gas emissions per megawatt of power produced. So a transition towards gas automatically reduces the amount of emissions we see coming out of the power system. And when you add that to the increasing share of renewables in the system we've seen in Australia over the last 10 to 15 years, then that has a very, very significant effect on our total greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a good thing. It by no means ensures that the power system is net zero, because that's very difficult, but it is reducing emissions over time.
Good. Finally, Brian, we might just go back and reflect on some work you did 18 months or so ago when you did a very important piece of research, as it turned out, on the cost of emissions reductions targets, comparing what was then the Labor policy for a large reduction by 2030 with the Coalition's smaller reduction target. And it had a big influence on the election. I think everybody would accept that. It proved a bit of a thorn in opposition leader Bill Shorten's side. But now looking back with 18 months later, you'd have to say, I think effectively that argument is being won. People do now accept, certainly in the political arena, that there is a cost to whatever you do towards achieving those climate change goals, and that has to be brought into account. Would you say that's fair, or is that too optimistic?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether everybody accepts that there is a cost, but there is definitely a cost, and I think the important thing is that there are two types of costs. First of all, there's costs around changing the technology, introducing the new technologies that we'll need to see to drive towards net zero emissions at whatever time that target is being set, whether it be 2050, 2060, whatever. We're going to have a massive transformation in the economic system, and massive transformation in technology to make that happen. For example, in the case of Australia, or more generally, to get to net zero by 2050, we would need to see some negative emissions technology introduced by around 2035 to 2040. Now, at this stage, we know what those technologies might look like, but they're by no means commercial. So there's a lot of development that has to be done to introduce that sort of technology and get it to a point where it's going to be economic. And in addition to all of that technology transformation, that effectively means that there's a whole lot of people employed in traditional jobs that are going to have to find something else to do. And if you're a 55-year-old coal miner, the prospect of trying to find a new job is perhaps fairly daunting. So you can understand why people are concerned about these sorts of transformations and why they're so difficult politically.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you very much for contributing this report and to the public debate. I think one of the first things I learnt on this subject when I started looking at it closely about 10 or so years back is that it is very complex. The intersection between economics, technology and climate science is a very complex area, and thank you for helping us through it step by step.
Thank you.
So that, I hope, has given you an overview of our report, Powering Out a Pandemic, and why we at the Menzies Research Centre think gas is indispensable to Australia's future. You can download a copy of the report from our website, www.menziesrc.org. The Menzies Research Centre's work is independently funded. Please consider supporting us if you can with a tax-deductible donation or by becoming a subscriber from just $10 a month. You can find all the details of that on our website, www.menziesrc.org. And all that remains for me to do is to thank our production team, our donors and subscribers, and thank you for watching.